Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Professor Graeme Suthers is the National Director of Genetics for Sonic Pathology Australia. He trained in clinical and laboratory genetics in Sydney, Adelaide and Oxford, and held senior appointments in the South Australian public sector. His current role involves the development of genetic services for patients and families across Sonic's clinical and laboratory services Australia-wide. Now, Professor Graeme Suthers has been a regular guest on This Medical Life podcast. We always love having him, and we wanted to have a discussion with Graeme upon his impending retirement to learn more about him and his career. So we're going to delve into some of the personal aspects of your life. Graeme, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Steve. Delighted to be here.
Look, we've got so many things we'd like to ask you, but there's one thing that's been on my mind, and that is the book The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins many, many years ago, 1976. It brought awareness of genes to the public domain. In your world, did it have any impact on you whatsoever? Has it been just a blip or completely irrelevant? Because if I can bastardize the synopsis of it, he basically argued that the job of all our genes is single-minded, reproduce ourselves. How did that interact with your life at all? At all?
Steve, I'm intrigued that you brought it up because, yes, it did interact. I found it an intriguing book when I read it many, many years ago now, because it took the genetics that I knew about and looked at it from a different perspective, from an evolutionary perspective. And I found that useful to remind myself that you can have a body of facts, of agreed facts, but look at them from different angles and draw different conclusions. I'm not saying the conclusions are contradictory, but if you sort of step it round and look at something from the side rather than the front, you get a different view of whatever those facts are. And I thought it was an intriguing book from that point of view. The big complaint I have about the book is that Richard Dawkins presented that idea then as being the sum total of evolution, that evolution need only or can only be understood in terms of gene pressure, and that evolution occurs at the level of the gene. Now, it was only some years later that I came across, don't profess to have read deeply in this area, but I came across other experts who argued that evolution occurs at the level of the individual, the summation of the individual's genes, and others who argued that it occurs at the level of the tribe, if you will, or the population, and the summation of all the genes and variants that are present within that population. And I think, again, those are different perspectives that you can take looking at the same data from different positions. So rather than it just being the selfish gene, which I think is far too narrow a focus, we can see evolution occurring at the level of the gene, at the level of the individual, at the level of a population. And there will be different forces at play at different times in the story that have impact at different levels. So from that point of view, I think his message was incomplete. I think, too, it was incomplete in that we are more than the sum of our genes. So, Steve, you and Travis have slight variations in your genetic code, which is why you are demonstrably different people, but you are individuals, and there are characteristics and attributes of you that I would argue would be well nigh impossible to tie down to a particular gene. That there is a holistic view of a person which is far, far more than their genes. So I am concerned at the implicit reductionism of the selfish gene, that everything can be explained by genes, and also the implicit determinism, that everything is determined by your genes. But if everything was determined by our genes, we wouldn't send kids to school.
That's true. And then what happens when we have those genes that malfunction, that throw a spanner in the works and create brand new variations?
Well, actually,
True.
that touches on an interesting point, talking about school and everything, because I want to come back to your career. Because Richard Dawkins is very interesting. We might agree or disagree. All of us have different opinions. But can I take us back to your start of your career? Because you actually started specialising in paediatrics. Now, why was that?
Travis, I've always enjoyed kids. That's just part of me. I enjoyed being a medical student and learning things there. I enjoyed the first couple of years of adult medicine, but did find that it was challenging but enjoyable. But as I looked down the corridor of time, as it were, I thought to myself, which of my mentors that I'm seeing, whether it be in general practice or in specialist medicine, dealing with adults, do I really want to emulate? And with due respect to all of them, there wasn't much attraction there, because for me the emotional satisfaction came from dealing with children. And so, after doing 2 years of adult medicine, which was a good introduction, Life, the Universe, and everything, I headed over to the old Children's Hospital in Camperdown and started training in paediatrics there, and that was very satisfying. But just as a reflection on my rationale. This will sound weird to some of my paediatric colleagues, but one of the things I found most satisfying was having an anxious parent worried about her child. And if I could provide reassurance that she was doing fine, that parenting is tough work, but this kid is okay and she's okay, that for me was a very satisfying interaction. I got more out of that than medical heroics.
So then how did you find your way into genetics research from paediatrics?
So that was the trigger for that was being in casualty at the old Children's Hospital late one night, and a child came in with a complication from an inherited error of metabolism, which is one of these sort of biochemical disorders. It was fairly rare, but he had a well-recognised complication of that. It was a quiet night in casualty, and as I was reading through his notes, and we'd sorted out the immediate issues, but I was reading through his notes, I realised that he was not on the medication that my textbook said he should be on. And at that time I was studying for my paediatric exams. So I wrote to his specialist, who was a specialist in metabolic diseases of children, and said, this child's been admitted to hospital with XYZ, we've done such and such, and I'm intrigued. Why has he been treated with X rather than with Y? And she wrote back a lovely letter very promptly, which explained the background, and I thought this was fascinating, and I was hooked on the idea of understanding the processes, the biochemistry underlying this child's problem and that field of metabolic genetics, as it was called. So at that point, I had failed one exam, and I needed to go back and do that again. So in the interim, I contacted places where you could do training in this space and studied hard and was all ready for my new career in metabolic genetics, only to fail the next exam. So that was my second failure. That was good for my psyche and my soul, but it wasn't particularly good for my emotional state at the time. And by the time I passed the exams on the third try, those training positions had gone. So I was then confronted with having a deep interest in wanting to work in genetics, but the very pathway that I'd chosen was now closed off. So I was in Sydney at that time, and with a sense almost of desperation, I looked around and visited Adelaide and spoke to some people here as sort of a second best, but it wasn't second best. Yeah. It was fantastic. And there was some superb people in the clinical area, superb people in the laboratory area, and I spent 3 years immersed in clinical and laboratory genetics in what I think in hindsight was indeed the best place in Australia to do it. And it remains a very strong place.
Now, can I touch on one part of this? Because I think it's something that's overlooked, particularly when we're finished training, because I have failed an exam before, and I want to just sort of bring that up again. How did it make you feel? How did you manage that? Because a lot of people who are going through training, doctors, medical students, are not used to failing exams. And when it comes to postgraduate exams, they're hard. And failure is actually quite common. And how did you manage that?
Look, I think that there are a number of elements, and this I can only describe my experience. So I'm describing my experience rather than prescribing a solution for the challenge that you've presented, because each person will need to respond in a different way. The first thing for me is I had and still have a very strong relationship with a supportive spouse, and so she was a centre, so that in terms of my value as a human being, that was assured. Also, that I've been a Christian for many years, and so I had a sense of purpose, not in the sense of a divine purpose of you will do X, but that there was, if there wasn't a purpose for my life, there was at least a purpose in my living and doing that in the best way that I could. And the third thing was it was shattering. And I needed to let go, and that was a bit emotional, let go of our anger and frustration around that, and come to a decision as to whether this was worth pressing on. Is it really worth all of this pain? And so I was prepared to give it a third go. And I think by the time I got to my third go, I'd grown up. And instead of being in I'll call it, for me, cocky med-student mode. I'm not suggesting that all applicants for postgraduate exams are cocky med-student mode, but for me, I had moved from that to more considered professional.
Just while we're reflecting, because I'm not sure how often you medical people reflect honestly about that personal aspect of your journey, but there's something else from your story earlier when you wrote to that specialist, Graeme, and she took the time to write back to you, and something that Travis has brought out in almost all the histories of different medicines and diseases. It's when someone's gone above and beyond to answer a question or to just happenstance. The Nobel laureates we've spoken to, both of them, it's because someone went above and beyond to prod them and help them. This, surely there must be some enduring request on behalf of all of us to everyone in the medical realm to leave that aspect of their lives open where they're able to respond to a med student or to a colleague. And I don't know, how much do you see that going on, Graeme, over your career, that willingness amid the busyness and stress to take time to answer and reflect?
So it's a good point, Steve, and it encapsulates the importance that if you're going to be a healthcare practitioner of any type, then it must be a relational thing. You need to relate to the person before you. They have a depth of experience of whatever condition it is that you as the health practitioner will never have unless you've got the same condition. But you as the healthcare practitioner can bring a broad view of the understanding of many people with similar or the identical condition. And it's that combination of the patient's depth and the clinician's breadth that then becomes very empowering in finding a way to deal with things. But you're only going to achieve that if there is some sense of relationship between the two. So if we think of healthcare, and I'm using healthcare professional very broadly here, it's far more than just doctors. But if we are to look at the provision of healthcare in that way, it becomes far more than a process. And most of our teaching, and I can only speak for doctors, has to do with the process of healthcare. I remember when I was a med student that we did have a particular course dealing with the relational side of healthcare. And with due respect to the people who provided that course, it didn't hit the mark at all because it was being presented in a didactic way having a lecture about how to care for your patient is not, it doesn't cut through. You learn the relational aspect of healthcare by watching it, by being included in it. And so some of the key lessons that I learned about relational healthcare, I learned from good clinicians who I was working with, or even better, some of the best nursing sisters were the ones who would take me aside and say, I think that we could tackle this a different way, Graeme. You're right. So I think the pressure, it's much easier to teach process than relationship. Much easier to examine process than relationship. But to be effective, you actually need to have the relationship. Now, there will be some aspects in the healthcare process which do not require that. So there will be some elements, whether it be in pathology or medical research or imaging or indeed surgery, where I would prefer to place more, I'd like the practitioner to, if anything, have more process knowledge than relationship knowledge. Yeah. But if that's the only player you have, that's a pretty sterile relationship. So you need other people in the team who can broker the relationship side. So we need a mix of people in healthcare, and they need to work effectively with each other. And the process is part, but not the whole of the story.
Now, despite all the negative effects and not making through the exams, but eventually making it through, you found yourself way into Sydney and to end up being in Oxford. How did you find that training?
So the training that I did I did start my genetics training just for 6 months in Sydney, and I worked with Professor Gillian Turner, who was an Australian leader in the area of intellectual disability, particularly intellectual disability due to abnormal genes on the X chromosome. Jill was someone who did model relationship and how that worked. And she had identified a number of families where there was clearly an X-linked pattern of inheritance, with affected boys and men in the family being related to each other through unaffected women. And this was a large family, and I was interested. At that point, I knew I was heading over to Adelaide. There's always a bit of a lead time with these sorts of things. And the laboratory in Adelaide that I'd be working with also had interest in the same area. And they were at the scientific end, working out what these genes were, or at least trying to. This was the early days of genetics. So Gillian Turner suggested that I join her to meet the family, and Gillian contacted the matriarch of this family in Sydney and arranged that we meet at Grandma's home in Western Sydney. And so we arrived there to find a large family gathering with a surprising number of intellectually disabled boys and men, and intellectually normal men also from the family, and wives, daughters, etc., mothers there as well. And in the course of the afternoon, I collected about 30 blood samples from members of this family. And Jill, in modelling the relationship mode, she sat at the table in the lounge room with the matriarch and drank cups of tea all afternoon. She smoothed the process while I ferreted around and did the process work, if I could put it that way. But that was a wonderful resource, which went over to Adelaide, and when I joined the group in Adelaide 6 months later, we began working on that. And within a year, we had identified where that gene was on the X chromosome. We were able to show that this gene was different from other known genes known to cause intellectual disability. So this was a new form of X-linked intellectual disability, and that sort of got my engaged my interest. Publications came out of that. It took a long time to go the next step and identify the precise gene and the mutation that was in that. That took another 25 or so years. But with that mapping information, knowing where that gene was on the X chromosome, we could now provide reliable carrier advice and prenatal diagnosis to women in the family who wished to have that information. So that was liberating. That was liberating for them, and it was liberating for me to realise that I could engage with the family and go through to the laboratory to come back with a result that could go back to the family and be useful for them.
And we go deep into that story in a previous episode.
Yep, there was a Fragile X episode that we discussed with Graeme, which was, really eye-opening. Now, can I ask, this has been a field of medicine that clearly goes into, there's theological elements, there is ethical elements, there is challenges that if you were wanting to go into a difficult area of medicine, I think genetics would be. Can I ask you, from your just looking at your career, has there been any really highlights or real challenges that you have had during this time that you still either struggle with or you say, I really loved that time?
Look, I think there have been lots of struggle points and lots of love points, and it would be hard to pick them out, to pick the peak or the trough out of that experience. I guess one that I will flag is right at the beginning of my experience in clinical genetics, back in the late 80s, clinical genetics largely involved the evaluation of children who were born with some congenital abnormality. And we didn't have fancy genetic tests available back then. They were still quite rudimentary. And much of the diagnostic process was done by the Marfan eyeball and frontal lobe and reading books and so on, looking at for nuances in the pattern of abnormalities and using that to say, well, we think this is this particular condition which has been recognised before, and these are the implications of that particular diagnosis. Whilst that was intriguing in a process sense, I did find it personally quite confronting because my wife and I didn't have any kids at that point. And I was spending my working days looking at all the problems that could occur if you have children. And I actually found that quite difficult. Now, as it turned out, we ended up adopting children. That's a separate story. So in that sense, I was spared some of that challenge. But it was recognizing the challenge that presented me with made me more sensitive, I think, to the challenges that couples face who do have a child with a congenital abnormality, and was one of the reasons that I had been tempted to stick with medical research, and I thought, no, I actually want to get back into the messiness of clinical practice, because that's where these issues have to be sorted through. You can't just move the emotions, the ethics, the whatever off to one side. You have to confront them. And that then came to the fore more recently in my time with Sonic, with the introduction of non-invasive prenatal testing. So this is a test that is designed to identify a pregnancy in which there is a high likelihood of there being a significant chromosome disorder. Now, I mentioned earlier that my Christian faith is important to me. Where do I stand in terms of abortion, and where do I stand in terms of what you do when you have a result like that in your hand? And I'm not going to give you a simple answer, because I don't think there is a simple answer to that question. That's my personal opinion. But I thought the way I managed that was to recognise the tension and to endeavour to provide the most informative and responsible test that we could, so that people could make informed choices of their own about whether they want the test and what to do with the result. But that tension has always been there for me. I don't regard any of these tests or the decisions associated with them lightly.
It certainly is what we hope from our medical practitioner in any form, is to inform us so we can make an informed decision, I think. But then, as you know, in your field, we need a lot of support with some of the ramifications of the decisions we'd make. Just before we take a short breather, I wonder, if you look back in your time in genetics, here we go, here's a simple one. Right from the start, now your impending retirement, can you give us a broad brush sense of how the practice of genetics has changed over that time?
How long have I got?
Take all of 60 seconds.
So, Steve, in the late 80s, I mentioned that was a time where it was the Marfan eyeball was the one of the main diagnostic tools of a clinical geneticist. And the tests that we had at that time involved measuring really the length of fragments of DNA. And I'll spare you the details, but you could use that length or variation in length as a clue about a particular gene, where it was, and so on. So that was fairly rudimentary type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Oxford with a postdoctoral fellowship, a Nuffield fellowship, and when I got to Oxford in 1990, it was there was a bit of an acceleration in terms of the technologies and methodology available, and Oxford was clearly at the leading edge of that. And what happened over the next 10 years is that the genetic capability expanded quite rapidly. Instead of having only 20 or so genes that everyone knew about and that had been cloned and sequenced, there were now genes coming out, a new one every week or two. Now, new gene every week or two might sound pretty fast, but if there are 20,000 genes, you've got a long way to go. So it seemed extraordinary in the early 90s, just became more and more extraordinary as techniques improved, automation increased. And so there became a rapidly increasing intersection of the clinician's Mark I eyeball and the laboratory's ability to sequence individual genes. And so by the end of the 90s, genetics was very much a thriving cottage industry. It was still very much grounded in research environments, but at the intersection with healthcare. So most the genetic requests and testing and so on was often brokered through a clinical geneticist who was attached to a teaching hospital, sometimes by another medical specialist, although that was relatively uncommon back then, but again, in a teaching hospital, and there wasn't a lot of genetics happening in the community. If we move forward then to the noughties, so in about 2006, there was a dramatic change in our ability to sequence DNA, and the cost of DNA sequencing dropped 10,000-fold within a matter of a few years, an extraordinary shift. And that meant that instead of sequencing one gene at a time, people could begin to sequence lots of genes at a time. And that revolution in sequencing led to what I'll call the mainstreaming of genetics. Instead of genetics being a super specialty and you had to get everything done through your clinical geneticist, it became a specialty, but it was one that was accessible by all specialists in teaching hospitals. Still not a great deal in the community, but it was becoming more mainstream. That threw up all sorts of education challenges because most doctors have not received much training in genetics, let alone genomics. If we come to the last decade or so, we have seen that mainstreaming accelerate. We've seen the application of these new genetic technologies to tests like non-invasive prenatal testing, which is the simple NIPT involves the analysis of tens of millions of DNA fragments per test. So an extraordinary proposal. And these tests are now available at the pen of any doctor across Australia, and most NIPT tests, for example, are ordered by general practitioners. So we have seen this enormous shift towards the democratization, if I can put it that way, of genetics, more readily accessible. That throws up problems and challenges, but that's the nature of change. The other thing that has changed for the specialists is that the Mark I eyeball was only so good. Maybe 20 to 30% of the children who came to a clinical geneticist in the 80s or 90s could be diagnosed. The remaining 70% or so of children had a condition that no one could put their finger on. But now we can sequence not only numbers of genes, but all the genes in a person. And that is radically reshaping our understanding of the genetic basis of congenital disorders. And whilst I wouldn't want to put the Mark I eyeball to rest, it still has a critical role. Human beings are very good at pattern recognition. It's a part of we're wired that way.
Yes.
And so you wouldn't want to dismiss the Mark I eyeball, but we're increasingly finding that the gene sequence is the first test, and then it's refined by the eyeball rather than the other way around.
All right. My head is spinning and I'm going to listen to my selfish gene, and let's take a breather for a few moments because we want to get even more personal when we come back. Professor Graeme Suthers is with us in this special interview to mark his impending retirement. And we want to look at some elements of your personal practice in the field of genetics. But I have to ask, because you talked about the advances in your sphere over the span of your career. If we look at the world of fiction just briefly, movies, TV shows, has any fictional story done justice to genetics in a way that passes muster with you, or obviously, or the reverse?
Steve, you're probably asking the wrong person. My wife and children would say I'm not the go-to person for contemporary culture. But there was.
I'll take a silent movie reference. You can reference it. That's fine.
The movie Gattaca came out in about 2000 with the lovely Uma Thurman, Ethan Hawke. And that was a fascinating story because it envisaged a near future where a person's, and we're coming back to the selfish gene discussion, a person's DNA sequence was deemed to determine their future. And so every child had their complete genome sequenced at birth. This was hypothetical back then because they couldn't do it, but it didn't take long, and took a few years and they could. But every child was sequenced at birth, and on the basis of the genome sequence was sent down a particular pathway for life, whether they would be a labourer, factory worker, whether they'd be a nuclear physicist, or whether they'd be a pilot, an astronaut for the colonisation of Jupiter. And that was very strictly enforced. And there were regular DNA checks performed during a person's life to ensure that the right person with the right genetic code was doing a particular job. So our young hero is desperate to join the space mission, which is colonising Jupiter. And he is denied that because of his genetic code. And I won't ruin the story because it's still a good film to see, but it addresses this issue of the reductionism and determinism of the genetic code and the dangers of that path. So I thought it was a great movie. We had it as mandatory viewing for new people joining our genetics clinic. We would every so often have a cracky dacks and pizza night so that we could sit down and watch the VHS video of that movie, because it warned us not to get too cocky about the genetic information we have access to.
Mm-hmm. Now, can I ask, is there a story or a moment in your practice that fundamentally shifted the way you approached medicine or genetics?
I was trained within a sort of teaching hospital specialist environment in a discipline of medicine that was changing rapidly and was driven very much from the research laboratory. I had my own PhD. I'd done a postdoctoral project. I had publications. So in a sense, I had I had the right pedigree to provide these services. And there was, in Adelaide at the time, there were a couple of us geneticists, if I can put it that way. And that's not true. There were three. There were three of us geneticists. And there was one genetic counsellor who worked with us. And a genetic counsellor is someone who is an allied health professional, these days coming from a background in nursing or science or psychology, who's done further training around genetics. But back then, in the 80s, it was not a well-defined discipline. And the genetic counsellor, looking back on it, was very much used as the clinical geneticist's handmaiden, if I can put it that way, that they ran around and got the family information and so on, but the real decision-making, that was made by the geneticist, and the real interaction, the real relationship stuff, you can hear the sarcasm in my tone,
yes,
was done by the medical specialist. And we're inevitably shaped by the environments we grow up in. So whether I agreed with that or not, I was shaped by it. In 2001, I took long service leave and we put our kids into a clapped-out caravan and went around Australia for 3 months. There's another story that would require a lot of alcohol. And the question was, how would the clinics that I was responsible for at that time, how would they continue in my absence? One of my colleagues kindly stepped into the breach to provide some oversight. but he had his own activities to do. So there was no way that the routine services could be maintained, and that wouldn't be fair to the patients. So by force of circumstance, the genetic counsellors who were there at that time, and we had a number at that point, necessarily took over running the clinics. And when I came back from leave, all ready to put back into place the same things as it was before, they said, "No way, Jose." And I was confronted for a moment. I thought, well, why not? That this is going to be a much more cost-effective service, and I suspected, and it turned out, more effective service, by having people who are actually better at the communicating and navigating the relationships. It's a key component of genetic counsellors training. So we turned the model on its head, and all of our clinics were run by the genetic counsellors, and they would call me in, if required, as the big kahuna. Now, that meant then we could expand the services that we provide with, I think, an improvement in service rather than any compromise of service. And that was an important transition for me. And there are all sorts of lessons there about listening to your colleagues, not presuming about who does what, and basically putting the patient's interests first. And then you work out how to achieve that. You don't say, this is how I'm going to achieve it, and assume that the patient will fit in.
Can I ask, is there a patient or a family that sticks in your mind? Sometimes, again, you're out gardening or something. Is there something that comes back into your mind that just sort of triggers a memory of someone or a family that has affected you in your career?
There is. I remember a girl called Olivia. She would have been about 9 years old. She was a pretty girl, but had a significant intellectual disability. Her mother brought her to see me, and it was to try and work out what the cause is. And at that point, she was one of the many children where no particular cause could be identified. There wasn't a pattern of abnormalities to allow me to sort of go to the textbook and say, this is what this is. And we ended up talking about, she was understandably concerned about the future for her child. What am I going to do in terms of school? School was already a problem, and that was going to get worse. What am I going to do in terms of long-term care and so on? Now, that's a bit outside my scope as a clinical geneticist. I was primarily a diagnostician, but we had a conversation about what it is that provides some assurance for someone's future, and realised that Olivia actually was an appropriately sociable girl. That you can have inappropriate sociability, but she was appropriately sociable. And between us, we recognised that was going to be a very strong attribute for her, that wherever she might be, an ability to get along with people, to be a pleasant person, was actually going to be more important to her than intellect. Now, we all know from our lives that people that we know, some of whom are very bright, and I think perhaps you referred to yourself as a sociopath, tongue-in-cheek one point earlier in our conversation. We know that there are people who can be very intelligent, but socially just can't do it. And that's not a happy state to be in or to be around. Whereas Olivia was presenting the opposite, that she was sociable, and that we recognised that was going to be a very strong attribute for her. And the key thing for her mum was to nurture that, to foster that, to give Olivia the positive reinforcement when she was being sociable, appropriately sociable. And bumped into her mother many years later. Actually, my wife bumped into her many years later, and the mother still remembered that conversation and how it had shaped her rearing of Olivia, and that Olivia hadn't improved in her intellect, but was developing her sociability.
Wow. Graeme, move to your imagination now. You're on the set of This Is Your Life. Mike Munro, or go back to Ray Willesee. They're about, was it Ray? Mike Willesee. What is it that they could draw attention to from your career that might not be the obvious thing, that would surprise and delight you, that had been singled out as something worthy of reflecting upon?
Oh, Steve, are you allowed to pause this podcast while I go away and think? One of the great experiences I've had, which many of my colleagues haven't, and it's not a criticism of them, it's just an observation, is I spent the first few years of my genetics training in a combination of clinical work and research, both in Adelaide and in Oxford. And then came back to Adelaide, concentrating and worked in the Women's and Children's Hospital for quite a few years as a clinical geneticist. And during that time, developed my interest in genetic pathology. And at the age of 47, I completed the exams to become a genetic pathologist as well as a clinical geneticist. And that was a bit of a challenge to go back to exam anxiety after all those years. And I found it really very helpful to be able to straddle that divide between the laboratory and the clinic. That really came to the fore about 9 years ago when I left the public sector and joined Sonic Healthcare and took up the position of National Director of Genetics for Sonic Healthcare Australia Pathology. And the thing that I have found really satisfying, and people tell me sets me apart, is that because I've had that background in the clinical world, in the research world, in the laboratory world, and there's been a bit of commercial stuff in there as well, I could bring all of that to bear into this new role. And my colleagues are often intrigued that I can just pluck a name out of my address book and say, well, this is the person you need to speak to about that, whatever, or that people have come to me, much to Sonic's surprise, they've come to Sonic and to me and say, would you help us do X, Y, Z? And it just reflects that diversity of experience. So I've really valued being able to work across those different domains. The shift to the private sector was not one that I had anticipated early in my career, but I'm very glad that I've given this a go. And if I could sort of encourage people more generally to have more transition between the public and private sectors in pathology in particular and in healthcare in general, I think our healthcare system would benefit from that.
And that's yet another black mark for Gattaca, because they would not have allowed that crisscrossing, and look at the richness we would have been robbed of in life.
Oh, can I ask, taking you out of your medical role, is there a career that you would have chosen had you not gone into medicine?
I had thought when I was in the middle years of high school that I'd like to become a Qantas pilot. That was glamorous and that was mechanical and all those sorts of things. Then just before, it must have been in about year 11, Travis, Qantas cancelled its cadet program. And they decided that people would go off and train themselves at their expense and then be brought into the Qantas fold. And so that knocked that on the head, which is just as well, because I found that I do not have a stomach for flying. I might have the eyes and the hands for flying, but my stomach is very much an on-the-ground portion of my anatomy. So I can thank the Lord that fate stepped in and limited that. I think I would have gone down the scientific path. I enjoyed science, chemistry, biology. So I think I would have ended up in some science-type domain.
And do you ever lose your luggage? Because that could have been part of your pilot's career as well.
There are certain stories about lost luggage that I won't reference on your delectable podcast.
All right, well, let's take one last breather and come back for the home straight.
Right.
We're with Professor Graeme Suthers. He's retiring shortly at the time this goes out. Graeme, looking back, because you get this chance now to sit in this chair of wisdom, what advice do you have for medical students and newly qualified doctors?
I'm going to frame it as a caution and then as an action. The caution is, please, please, please do not think that the medicine you have been exposed to as a student represents the full scope of medical practice. There is far more that goes on out there than you will have had time to be exposed to. There is a real risk that if you are trained by medical specialists in teaching hospital, you'll think that the only satisfying career in medicine is to be a medical specialist in a teaching hospital. And that is simply not true. Being a medical specialist in a teaching hospital can be very satisfying, but it's not the only satisfying part. In particular, there has been a decline in the teaching of pathology in the recent decade or more. And many medical students are simply unaware of this field of medical practice, which hasn't appeared on their horizon, but which forms the foundation of contemporary healthcare. And so I would encourage every student to look for different opportunities. If someone invites you to take a ride, as it were, always say yes. Go and see what is involved in being an ENT surgeon, in being a pathologist, in being a genetic pathologist. If there's a chance to go as a student on a retrieval flight with the Royal Flying Doctor Service, go and do it. You might want to take some anti-nausea pills as you get on board, Graeme, but go and do it so that you get to see the diversity of people and roles and relationships that are available to you.
Can I ask, there is clearly you have a passion for presenting, for teaching. You have been an amazing supporter of this podcast. Why do you think, is that something that you've always loved doing?
I'm a ham actor. You just need to only talk to my wife and my kids, the dodgy accents, the dad jokes. That's part of who I am.
Very good. We love it. Can I say then, with regards to your vision now, what is the future path of genetics?
I think the future path of genetics, the genetics that I've been brought up on, has been the analysis of the DNA sequence, the DNA code. There is a whole new chapter of genetics that is now opening up, looking at the RNA code. So the RNA is copied off the DNA, it's spliced and shifted into new molecules. And analysis of these RNA molecules is, again, revolutionizing all sorts of areas of healthcare. And I think the recognition that there are different analytes, there are different molecules types of molecules you can analyze, plus the methodology we have, is going to open up tremendous opportunities for useful interventions and cost-effective interventions. The danger that we face is the same one as we discussed in relation to the selfish gene at the beginning of this podcast. The danger of seeing this newfound genomic power and using that, or in thinking that reduces the complexity of the human condition to a test, and that the result of that test determines what the outcome will be for a particular person. And we must always be wary of those dangers, recognize them for what they are. And I'm not saying there are some tests, by the way, that will predict with a very high degree of probability of a problem to come. So I'm not diminishing that. But we need to make sure that we don't reduce the human condition to the result of a genetic test. And we need to resist that very strongly, because in the core of my being, I think that is wrong. I think it's wrong experientially, and I think it's wrong in principle. So that's a danger for us to look at. I think the big challenge in implementation for genetics is we have to consider reshaping how healthcare is delivered. And this is not just genetics, but healthcare has become very much more complex in the last generation. And instead of having a model whereby most healthcare was delivered by general practitioners who were very appropriately qualified, understood you and your context, and were able to manage most things with a specialist on the side, as it were, or a consultation. We're now finding that the complexity is such that it's the specialists who do much of the, if not most of the, decision-making around the more complex disorders. And that is reflected in changes in the medical workforce in Australia, where there has been a collapse in the number of medical students or medical graduates who want to train in general practice, and they're training in the medical specialties. And I can quite understand why that is. But I think that's to the loss of general practice and to the loss of that general overview of a person's care that only a GP can really provide. Now, the advances in genetics that I've described are exacerbating that and will make it even worse, where our system of Medicare rebates and so on is based on essentially a 1970s model of how healthcare is to be delivered. And I think we need a fresh discussion within our society about the best way of structuring, funding, operating our healthcare system to take advantage of the knowledge we have and the knowledge that we are going to have in the near future with these investigations.
You touched on general practitioners, and this is clearly a challenging area, even since I've finished my studies. Only 5-6 years ago, new things are cropping up that even at the end of specialist exams weren't present.
Yep.
So how do we help general practitioners who don't work in the field to stay up to date with the advance that it's clearly exponential in genetics?
So there will be, if you were to get 20 experts lined up and put that question, you'd probably get more than 20 answers to it. So recognizing that there will be other voices, I'll give you my view, but I certainly don't want it to be interpreted as being the only one. I think we need to revisit the role of the general practitioner in a consultation and the role of IT, of information technology, in supporting the general practitioner. The general practitioner is there primarily to act as your broker and advocate within the healthcare system. This is not to say that the general practitioner is not there to diagnose and treat and support and do all those other sorts of things. But the general practitioner is, in my opinion, by far the best starting point for a patient's journey and the best final point in the patient's journey, because it's the GP who is closest, and the GP is in the community and the GP is close to where the patient is. Now, this presumes that the GP is someone who you see on a regular basis rather than popping in to see just the next person available. I'll come back to that challenge in a moment. If we stick with the idea of a regular GP, then I think if we try and fill the GP's head up with all the knowledge that they require across all the disciplines of healthcare as well as genetics, then they'll spend all their time at training courses and never being a GP. And that won't be very satisfying or very effective. I think that we need to reshape our IT management systems so that they can support GPs and provide information about latest guidelines, to sum the results of many different investigations to say, have you considered this? It's at this point that your options are 1, 2, 3. And again, it's not to be prescriptive. It's not that we have an artificial intelligence doctor, but that we have an expert system, a system for the expert, which is the GP, to assist the GP in managing this. Mm-hmm. Now, there will always be a place for drop-in doctors where you're seeing a different person potentially each time, so don't disparage that. But I think we need to change funding models so that people are encouraged to go back to the same doctor, where doctors are encouraged to be accountable for the ongoing health, not just an episode of care, with the ongoing care of a patient. And again, where we have smart IT systems to facilitate that. Because there'll be some days where your favourite doctor is not available. Well, then there needs to be an IT system that will say, this is where we got to with this patient's favourite doctor. You're on the hot seat today, Dr. Davis. These are the issues of current concern for this patient. Manage today's issue. That'll be captured in the system, and then that information will be provided back to the patient's regular GP on his or her return. I think that we need to be thinking outside the box and utilising the new resources that are becoming available, rather than being trapped into 50-year-old thinking.
I'm disturbingly curious about what that system would be saying about me.
Now, can I ask, now that everything, you're professor, you are director of Sonic Genetics, is there any advice that Professor Graeme would give budding Graeme Suthers, the either medical student or early doctor? Is there any advice that you would give that young man coming through the system?
I said earlier how important it is to not be constrained by what you've seen and to look, in a sense, around the corner under the carpet, look for other avenues. So I think I would stick with that. The only other point I would add is that I went straight from school to uni into my internship specialty training. And there are certain advantages to that. If I was to live that again, the one thing I would have done different would have been to my young wife and I, or my new wife and I, would have been good if we'd taken a year off and just paused to smell the roses, because we'd run really hard through the late school years and uni years, and then we continued to run hard. Now, I'm hoping to be able to slow down in a few weeks' time and to begin to smell the roses again. But I think it would have done me some good and our relationship some good if we had had time to consolidate our relationship before getting lost in the rapacious medical treadmill.
Wow. Well then, we always ask this question at the end of our podcasts, Graeme. Advice or final thoughts for general practitioners, medical students, scientists in the field of genetics? Any things you'd like to share with them?
Genetics is like sand at a beach picnic. It gets into everything, and I mean everything. So if you don't have a genetics part of your view, then you are missing the complete view. So whatever you're doing, there will be a genetic component to that. I would encourage people to talk to a colleague, pick up the phone, build a relationship with your local genetic pathologist, genetic counsellor, clinical geneticist, whatever it might be, so that when you look, if you have any questions, obviously that's easy to ask, but also you might have something where when you look with your genetic lens, you realise you don't know what the genetics might be that are pertinent for a particular situation. Ask.
Wow. Well, we wish you all the best as you transition, yet another transition into retirement. But I'm going to throw one bonus question in. It's got two parts to it. I get all this information coming through that genetics is going to solve the problem of aging, and we will soon be able to live forever. So my two-part question is there anything in the future that could indeed extend a healthy human life? And B, how would you feel if this was just a slight pause and you had another 200 years ahead of you in your field?
So, Steve, I think the challenge there is huge. If we think of the length of DNA in your body, there's about 10 light days of DNA in your body. If I was to take all of the DNA and lay it out end to end, it would take about 10 days to traverse that distance at the speed of light. Now, that length of DNA is not just a bit of bland string. It is a very precise genetic code. And so if we were to maintain that genetic code, you'd need to be able to identify and correct errors in that. And that would take a fair amount of energy. The second law of thermodynamics says that if you want to maintain order, this is my paraphrase on it, if you want to maintain order, you need to put energy into a system. So I don't know that anyone's actually worked out how much energy would be required to maintain 10 light days worth of DNA in its pristine state. But I think it would suffice to say that it's lots. And my question is, how could that be applied? And even if it is applied, we must remember that genes are not all that we are, that our memories and so on are going to be shaped by proteins and methylation and all sorts of other things that make us who we are. So I think whilst I'm sure that there will be actions that can be taken to extend our lives, I doubt it would be possible to achieve eternal life, as it were, unending life. Let me say, I think that there are some people who are proposing a different approach to this, which is to upload all of your thoughts and emotions and processes into a computer, and then you don't face that problem at all. I am very wary of that because it's a bit like artificial intelligence. We call it artificial intelligence, but in fact, it's not very intelligent at all. No. And I think that if you think about what you might be able to upload into a computer, you're constraining your understanding of the human condition. So in my view, I don't think that these things will happen in the grand sense that you've described. Would I want them to? Comes down to who you are and what you believe. So we come back to Travis's theological question. For me, I've lived a good life. I've been able to raise children to independence and to be nice men. I've had a career where I've been able to provide professional services, to build some good relationships, and to feel that in a small way I've been able to leave my patch of the earth in a better way than it was. I've done a bit. And so if the good Lord were to call me home tomorrow, that would be absolutely fine. I'm sure there'd be people around who would be disappointed, but I'm confident that in my life after death, and so I would not be fussed by that call home.
I think that means you're not getting an invite to Steve's 300th birthday.
Either that or I'll send you a lightning bolt.
I'll raise a toast to you. Professor Graeme Suthers, thank you so much for everything you've done, but also for being part of This Medical Life.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Travis. It's been a pleasure.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.